one of the most debated governance tools in recent times. The Aadhaar card was meant to provide a unique identity for every Indian, but practically, as of today, without an Aadhaar card, an average Indian citizen would find it very difficult to access basic services. From death to birth, from school admissions to mobile phone services, an Aadhaar card is needed for everything. Which is why the hearing by the Supreme Court beginning tomorrow, that is the 17th of January, is so important. A clutch of petitions will be heard which question whether the Aadhaar violates privacy, whether it ought to be mandatory, and whether social benefits are being denied to the poorest of the poor because of Aadhaar. To talk more about Aadhaar's big test in the Supreme Court, I'm joined this evening by Nikhil Kumar, fellow at the iSpirit Foundation and a defender of Aadhaar, and Rahul Matthan, partner at Trilegal. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Matthan, I will begin with you. Tell us why this hearing is so crucial.
So I think the test that the Supreme Court has laid down in the Puttaswamy judgment, which is essentially a test to see whether any enactment of the government violates privacy or not, was only laid down in that 9-judge bench. And the entire proceedings with regard to Aadhaar were put on hold until the higher bench of the Supreme Court could adjudicate on what it would take in order to see whether, first of all, whether there's a right to privacy, and then after there is a right to privacy, how to test government action against the right to privacy. So now that we've got the threefold test that the Supreme Court laid down, it has now come to the 5-judge bench to actually apply that test to Aadhaar and to see whether Aadhaar actually fulfills the 3 conditions that are required to be fulfilled in order to be able to say that Aadhaar does not violate privacy.
Okay, so, I want to take this discussion through the 3 main points, and I've broken them up very broadly speaking. Let's begin with privacy, because that's where Rahul has started. And Nikhil Kumar, I want you to come in on that. We have had the Tribune story recently, which showed how easily the Aadhaar database could be accessed for a small fee. We've seen the UIDAI introduce a virtual ID for Aadhaar, now Face ID, limited KYC. It's clearly some extent of damage control before this issue of privacy, is presented on a larger stage at the Supreme Court.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I would rather say more than damage control, these are necessary things that had to be done for all the legit concerns that people have been raising. If you look at the work on VID, this has been there for quite some time, but the timing was not right. So for the benefit of the viewers, just to help clarify, the Tribune story was mostly about breach of or misuse of a particular username and password given to a employee to help for grievance redressal. And this could happen not just in Aadhaar, it could happen with a telco or a bank. And this actually exposes the vulnerability that why we as consumers require a strong data protection law and framework, and the government has already taken some steps towards that. On to the second point about virtual ID and face authentication. Virtual ID has been introduced to basically help those people who are sensitive about their privacy, about them sharing their Aadhaar numbers publicly, so that they can generate a virtual ID and they can share that instead of their original Aadhaar number. And this is not mandatory, and this is only for people who believe that they have issues in terms of privacy in sharing Aadhaar. The second one, the face authentication, which was announced yesterday,
yes,
is basically a mechanism to help improve the authentication of biometrics. It's not a standalone verification system as misunderstood by people. It basically, let's say you are doing an authentication using your virtual Aadhaar number, and you are, let's say, an old person and your biometrics fail, you can now use face also as a third factor, as a fallback mechanism, so that the verification score, which is required to basically return whether this person is who he is, the probability of you getting verified successfully increases by adding face as another layer. So it's not more to do with security. It's largely to do with solving for those failures where biometric is failing.
Okay, so you're saying they've tried to cover point 2 and 3 of that graphic we just showed you, and point number 3 being that those who need basic services are being denied because of the Aadhaar system and how it works. But I just want to ask you, Rahul, about what the UIDAI has done in the last few days. Do you think that blunts some of the questions which will come up in this hearing, including privacy, including data security, because they have added more layers to the security system with virtual ID and limited KYC. They've split, those who have to take your data into global and local, and they've made the norms more stringent.
I don't know if this alone is going to change the way in which the Supreme Court looks at it. I think in order for the Supreme Court to uphold Aadhaar, it needs to understand the entire scheme of Aadhaar and assess whether that scheme is basically secure or not. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm not a technical person like Nikhil is, but just the basic scheme itself is reasonably robust. I think these additional layers are belts and braces. These are additional things that we are layering on to the system. But the basic system itself needs to hold up. I think adding something on in the last hour, as it were, is only going to, I guess, add to the perception of security. But in the Supreme Court tomorrow and over the next few weeks that the case is going to run, the government and the UID will have to prove that the system is fundamentally secure, and that all of these things that Nikhil just described are just additional layers of protection that will give you some greater comfort. I don't think they can get away from the fact that they have to prove that the basic system, as it's been running for all of these years, is fundamentally secure.
Let's come to the second point, which will be discussed in the Supreme Court over the next few days, and that is whether Aadhaar can be made mandatory when that was not the brief. And Nikhil, here you must agree with the aggression with which Aadhaar has crept into all of our lives, because for government schemes it's effectively mandatory for most things. Private operators or private companies have also jumped in and made it the primary identity proof. Is it actually a valid identity of address, of name? How much can you bank on it, or other issues which will come in? But was it supposed to be forced on people will be the key question.
Absolutely, and I've voiced this many times. I think the mandatory nature of Aadhaar is not welcomed by anyone when you're not basically getting any benefit or you're part of any welfare program from the government. However, as the Justice Chandrachud judgment and the privacy judgment noted, for the government to deliver welfare for various different people across, whether it's food, whether it's LPG or so on, they have the right, and basically their role is to ensure that the right services are delivered or the right benefits are delivered to those people. So in those cases, wherever people are subscribed to services from the government, it should be made mandatory. It's the prerogative of each department which is running the welfare program. However, for those who use services from private companies, whether it's banking or telco, of linking is not because of Aadhaar as an instrument. It's because of the PMLA guidelines which the regulators are following, whether it's the telecom regulator or the RBI, and have issued orders for these telecom companies to follow these norms. So I was making this case that essentially our appeal of not making this mandatory should be to the regulator and not to UIDAI, because UIDAI has no control on what the regulations of these particular sectors are, and these are issues which are dealt by TRAI and RBI and so on. Now, the third and final quick point that I want to make is it necessary for some private companies to make it mandatory? I think it's again up to the private company. Let's say if it's a startup is
Nikhil,
delivering services to someone.
Yeah. No, before you come to the
and it reduces the cost of the transaction.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, I just want to come into that. You talked about essential services, and you're basically talking about citizens who want, say, the PDS system. They want rations from the government, or they need benefits in their bank accounts. Once you made it mandatory for getting a birth certificate and a death certificate, you've covered everyone, Nikhil. Then there is no question of who is and isn't left out. There is no other way to look at it. It is now become a part of everyone's life. You can't even be born or die without an Aadhaar card.
Well, yeah, I like I said, I'm not someone who is a proponent of mandatory linking for Aadhaar for where it's not required. Like I said, wherever there is welfare, where there is money being transferred from the government to a citizen, and if that needs to be done in an efficient way, I think there is merit in that case. But for all the other use cases, like I said, it's not UADI or Aadhaar who's responsible for that. It's respective state governments, departments, and regulator who are making this mandatory. And we should focus our energy in trying to, appeal to these particular agencies to not make it mandatory, or the government should step in and say, hey, look, this is not required, and probably some sort of guidelines on where it should be made mandatory and where not should come up.
All right. Rahul, just quickly to push upon the last point, which will come up in these hearings over the next few weeks, and it links to the mandatory bit. Should it be made mandatory for welfare benefits? Nikhil says yes, because there's money going out and we need to know that there are no leakages. But that is also one of the reasons why reportedly a large number of people are not able to avail benefits that they desperately need. Will this be a key focus point?
If you look at the construct of the Aadhaar Act is essentially an act to assist the government in actually providing subsidies to people who are required to be provided these subsidies under the Consolidated Fund of India. And so this is a scheme that is, by its very design, intended to ensure that people can be identified so that the government subsidies and benefits can reach them. So if you look at the threefold test that the Supreme Court laid down to determine whether something violates privacy or not, whether a law violates privacy or not, there is a law. The law responds to a state need. That state need, of course, as I've articulated, is to ensure that the right subsidies and benefits get to the right person. The third question is whether it is proportionate. It seems to be proportionate just in terms of the limited amount of data that is collected in order to achieve this purpose. So to answer your question, I think with regard to providing benefits which are provided from out of the Consolidated Fund of India, to my mind, it would seem that the Aadhaar Act actually fulfills those purposes. I think it is entirely up to the government to determine which manner it needs to ensure that government services reach people in the most efficient manner. If they chose the Aadhaar, I think as long as it fulfills the threefold test, that should be fine. I think, of course, the government needs to also consider whether the technology is working fully and whether, because for some reason the technology doesn't work and people are denied their benefits, whether there are other alternatives that they can use. In that regard, I think this new face recognition technology that's being implemented could go a long way. I think a lot of the complaints have been with the fingerprint readers not picking up fingerprints. But now, as Nikhil indicated, there's a new technology, a third layer, that could potentially work for people who aren't able to prove any of their other two biometrics.
I had a conversation yesterday with a couple of experts on the Face ID, and they had an interesting point of view because the UIDI circular makes it very clear that they're not going to collect any new data. It's based on the photograph that was captured when each person's Aadhaar card was made. Now, people's faces change. Do we have the technology to be able to digitally recognize those same people over time? Can that reach far-flung areas where these services are most needed? Can that be rolled out in time are big questions which will be asked. And just a quick point of view on that, Nikhil. Can you deny even a single needy citizen of what they need because they don't have an Aadhaar card or their fingerprint doesn't match, even at the cost of reduced efficiency? That's a big question which will be deliberated upon.
Absolutely. So 2 quick points. Number one, on the robustness of the system, it's important to let people know on how well the system works. Then we've been only hearing about some of those cases where the system doesn't work. Aadhaar today, on an average, does 50 million authentications per day. And to the benefit of users, it's important to note that this is almost 3 to 4 times of all debit and credit card transactions that happen in India today. So the system is robust, it's scaled up very well. So it does around 50 million transactions every day, around 15 million KYCs every day. If you look at large companies, whether it's Reliance, Jio or Paytm, who are basically using this for KYC services, they wouldn't use this if the system was failing, right? On the second point, which you spoke about the Face ID, a lot of people have confused the Face ID to what we use on our mobile phones. And like I said, it's basically another layer which increases the probability of your verification. Now, do we have the technology to solve this? Yes, because today you can go and update your photograph in Aadhaar, and it's not something which is constant. So if you took a picture, let's say 5 years ago, you can now have an updated picture of yours on Aadhaar, and then from there on, the authentication system will pick it up so that verifications become more easier. So we do have the systems. You can do this via mobile OTP. You can walk into a nearest Aadhaar center, do your biometric verification, and update your picture. We do have the system. It will only take some time for people to actually realize the benefits of the new features that UID has rolled out.
All right. We'll have to end it at that. Big day tomorrow, and in the days to come, we'll be watching very closely how the entire Aadhaar case unfolds in the Supreme Court, because it touches upon so many issues which have been hotly debated over the last couple of years, I would say. Is Aadhaar actually delivering on what it promised, or has it become an intrusion into our lives? That's a debate which will be looked at very closely in the next few days to come.